What is the horror genre? Literary Criticism by Sharon A. Russell. In what ways are horror stories defined and categorized? This author tries to pin down the genre. Many people define horror by its subjects. We all think of creatures like Frankenstein's monsters, Dracula, and the Wolfman as monsters in the horror genre. Each one of these creatures has a history that developed over a period of time. But we also know that horror covers more than just these monsters. We could all make long lists of the kinds of creatures we identify with horror, especially when we think of films as well as literature. The minute we would start to make such a list, we would also realize that not all monsters are alike and that not all horror deals with monsters. The subject approach is not the clearest way to define this genre. Some students of this genre find that the best way to examine it is to deal with the way horror fiction is organized or structured. Examining the organization of a horror story shows that it shares certain traits with other types of fiction. Horror stories share the use of suspense as a tactic with many other kinds of literature. The tension we feel when a character goes into the attic, down into the basement, or just into the abandoned house is partly a result of suspense. We don't know what is going to happen, but that suspense is intensified by our own knowledge of the genre. We know that characters involved in the world of horror always meet something awful when they go where they shouldn't. Part of the tension is created because they are doing something we know is going to get them in trouble. Stephen King refers directly to our anticipation of horror. In Salem's Lot, Susan approaches the house, which is the source of evil. She found herself thinking of those drive-in horror movies, epics, where the heroine goes venturing up the narrow attic stairs or down into the dark, cobwebby cellar. And she thinking, I'd never do that. Of course, Sarah's fears are justified. She does end up dead in the basement, a victim of the vampire. If the horror genre uses the character's search for information to create suspense, it controls when and where we get our knowledge. Because we are outside of the situation, we usually know more than the characters. Our advanced knowledge creates suspense because we can anticipate what is going to happen. The author can play with those expectations by either confirming them or surprising us with a different outcome. When suspense is an important element of fiction, we may often find that the plot is the most critical part of the story. We care more about what happens next than about who the characters are or where the story is set. But setting is often considered a part of the horror genre. If the genre has traditional monsters, it also has traditional setting. Only authors who want to challenge the tradition place events in bright, beautiful parks. We expect a connection between the setting and the events in the genre. We are not surprised to find old houses, abandoned castles, damp cellars, or dark force as important elements in the horror story. Some people make further distinction based on how the stories are organized. We can divide the stories into different categories based on how they come to believe in the event, in the events related, and how they are explained to us. Stories that deal with parallel worlds expect us to accept those worlds without question. We just believe Dorothy in the Oz. We accept Oz as a parallel world separated from ours. Other times, events seem to be supernatural, but turn out to be natural explanations. The ghost turned out to be a squirrel in the attic, or things that move mysteriously are part of a plot to drive someone crazy. Sometimes the supernatural is the result of the way the central character sees the world, as in stories told from the point of view of a crazy person. But at times, we are not sure and hesitate about believing in the possibility of the supernatural. When I first read Dracula, I seriously considered hanging garlic on my windows because I believed that vampires could exist. This type of hesitation, when we almost believe, falls into the general categories of fantastic. Horror has its greatest effect on us because we almost believe, or believe while we are reading the book or watching the film, that the events are possible. Yet another way of categorizing works of horror is by the source of the horror. Sometimes horror comes from inside the characters. Something goes wrong inside, and the person turns into a monster. Dr. Frankenstein's needed for knowledge turns him into the kind of person who creates a monster, Dr. Jekyll. Also values the desire for information above all else and creates Mr. Hyde. In other kinds of horror stories, the threat to the central character or characters comes from outside. An outside force may invade the character and then force the evil out again. The vampire attacks the victim, but then the victim becomes a vampire and attacks others. Stories of ghosts or demonic possessions also fall into this category. We can also look at the kinds of themes common in horror. Many works concentrate on the conflict between good and evil. Works about the fantastic may deal with the search for forbidden knowledge that appears in much horror literature. Such quests are used in a way of examining our attitude towards knowledge. While society may believe that new knowledge is always good, the horror genre may question this assumption, examining how much adventure affects the individuals and society.